Alright, so welcome back to the second lesson in this tutorial on color grading, and effectively we're going to start off this tutorial by talking about some of the foundation tools that we need in order to color grade our images. And those tools will essentially take us into lesson 3, which will cover a few other tools, and between these two lessons, covering some of the tools, the blending modes, and the different ways that you can actually combine those tools with things like masks, and we'll have a pretty good foundation for what you'll need to know for the remaining lessons, where we'll actually take a more hands-on approach and color grade a few images. So let's start off. We're going to use this image here as our sort of sample image. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the two kinds of color grading that you can really do. And that's not to say that, you do one and not the other. In fact, we'll often mix them, but I tend to break it down into color-based grading or luminosity-based grading. And so generally speaking, you're going to be targeting either a specific color and adjusting that color, or you're going to be targeting a specific luminosity range. Effectively, what I mean by that is, let's say we want to take reds and make them more saturated, or we want to take reds and make them more magenta. We have a certain set of tools that we can use for that, and we're going to be covering those tools. On the other hand, maybe we don't care about the existing colors as much as we want to just sort of apply a certain cast to the image. So effectively, we're broadly saying, within the shadows, I want the shadows to feel very blue or very magenta. The highlights, I want them to be warmer, so I want them to be, a little bit more yellow, perhaps. Or I want them to be cooler. I want to inject a little more cyan into them. And then in terms of midtones, we typically don't really deal with midtones per se. Midtone targeting effectively adjusts the entire image. So if you want to apply a color cast, perhaps, that's where you would, work on the midtones specifically. For me, what I typically tend to do is I tend to work on the shadows and the highlights, and then apply a few targeted adjustments to specific colors to fine-tune them afterwards. But of course, there's no right and wrong, and in fact, we're going to look at situations where we, create color casts across a more broad range of the image. Basically, when we start off our color grading, the first thing I tend to want to do is to get my overall luminosity where I want it to be. Because, if you have an image that is very bright, and we kind of talked about this and alluded to it within the raw conversion stage, is that if I have this image here and I have it, darker, it has a very different mood than if I were to make it bright. And so that will affect my choice of colors. And for that reason, I like to start off with sort of my target overall luminosity. And generally speaking, ideally you would have the perfect luminosity out of your raw file. But, oftentimes I find that with my raw file, I like to have a luminosity that doesn't have any blown out shadows, doesn't have any blown out highlights, and essentially it's a good balanced starting point. And that's the same thing when it comes to the white balance itself as well. We were talking about that. Now, with this image here, I've actually got two white balances. You can see we have this sort of warmer one that gives you the impression that this was shot at sunset, which in fact it was. And then what I did was I created this one here, which I essentially neutralized a little bit more. Now there's still a little bit of this warm feel to it. I didn't want to take it out completely, but as you can see, the shadows are a lot more neutral in nature. The distribution of colors is a lot more uniform than here, where you can see if I go over this, if you look at the sort of distribution over here, we can see that the yellows certainly dominate at around 66%. So it's not as even. Now, obviously, our starting point will dictate what tools we'll use and what steps we'll take to grade this image. And then ultimately, if I wanted to keep this kind of feel to it, it would be best to start with this image here. There's no reason to start neutral, knowing full well that I'll be going towards a more sunset feel. Now we'll kind of replicate that a little bit as well, and we'll look at how those adjustments look different between the two different starting points. So like I said, the best place to start really is to get your actual luminosity where you want it to be. Now, the framework itself we'll talk about in the next lesson, and I'll take you through the steps that I always take from the start of the image to the end and where color grading fits into that. Right now, don't get hung up on that. Let's just talk about the tools individually, and then we're going to kind of put it all together in the next lesson.